Let us now welcome Mrs. Maro Ftelleha Markidou, head and co-founder of Life-Changing Ideas, looking for the how of innovation in discussion with Mariana Mazzucato.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning or good evening. Welcome to the Cyprus Forum 2021. My name is Maria Ftelleha, and I'm the head and co-founder of Life-Changing Ideas, which is part of global training at the University of Nicosia. Today, I will be talking to Mariana Mazzucato, a professor in the economics of innovation and public value at University College London, and one of the world's most influential economists who has skillfully challenged mainstream thinking about the role of the state and the private sector in driving innovation. Mariana is not only an academic, but also a policy shaper, and acts as an advisor to a wide range of governments and organizations around the world, including the Italian Prime Minister, the President of South Africa, the Vatican, and the World Economic Forum. Hello, Mariana.
Hello there.
Great
Buongiorno.
to have you with us. Buongiorno. Mariana, let's begin by talking about your thoughts and ideas on the entrepreneurial state, the role of the state versus the private sector, and the dynamic relationship between the two in creating and fostering innovation.
So first of all, if I can, I think we have to change the language. It's not about the state versus the private sector. It's about how can we actually build capable, strategic public organizations, capable, strategic private organizations, and how can they work together towards common goals. This is why I recently wrote a book called Mission Economy, because that's the way we got to the moon. We got to the moon and back in a generation, so it was a very targeted goal by actually setting a very clear direction. We had to answer, did we get there or not? And the state itself directed the process, but it did not micromanage it. There was plenty of different businesses, many different sectors, nutrition, electronics, software. But what the state did is it vested in its own capacity, its capability, and also paid a lot of attention to the relationship with business. Too often we use the word public-private partnership without building the right partnership. So I was fascinated when I was writing the book that NASA actually cared to redesign the procurement contracts in such a way that they would be much more dynamic, goal-oriented, very open on the how, almost like a prize scheme. And they also paid attention to how to share the rewards. So they had a no excess profits clause, precisely because the process was a collective effort between different actors. And today, in many different sectors, if we look at the health sector, the digital economy, and the space sector, you have lots of public money going in, lots of private money going in, but the partnership is problematic. It is often parasitic. It is not symbiotic and mutualistic. So these are, different features of the story, which I think we need to unpick. What is the intra-organizational capacity? What is the inter-organizational relationship? And how can we set common goals to go after together, as well as who sets those goals? And we might come to that later in the conversation.
Mariana, how far were your ideas accepted and adopted when you actually debunked the myth of public versus private innovation? Because you were among the first economists to come out and say, hey guys, this is not how it goes. Innovation doesn't happen from the private organizations, but it's a collective effort, and billions of investment has gone in from governments, from the public administration. So tell us whether your thinking influenced policy and government strategies.
Sure. In the entrepreneurial state, I told the story of the iPhone, which is that everything that makes all of our iProducts smart and not stupid were publicly financed: internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri. But that does not mean that the iPhone was made by the state. And so this is where some of the pushback comes to me. People say, oh, she says the state did everything. The state created the iPhone. And that's not what I'm saying. We needed the private sector to do its job. And if you look at what Apple did, it was very, they put attention to the design, because this is a beautiful phone. Everyone wants one. Many people have these phones. They had a whole concept of simplicity. What was interesting with Apple is they also brought in designers, musicians. It wasn't just technology, but the technology itself came basically from state institutions. And these institutions were purpose-oriented. So the internet, which is in our phones, of course, came from DARPA, which was trying to solve a problem. They wanted the satellites to communicate, and the internet was the answer. GPS, the Navy wanted to know where the ships were. GPS was the answer. So one of the questions today is, what are the problems that need solving, and how can we have ambitious public organizations that see themselves as purpose-oriented, problem-oriented, mission-oriented, and then the technology, whether it's in health, in digital, different problems which the Sustainable Development Goals present us, are the spillovers from that problem setting. And so I think the story that I told in the entrepreneurial state was quite attractive. People liked the story because it went against the usual mantra about Silicon Valley. But it again, I sometimes get, put into a straw man position where they say, oh, she's just telling how great the state is, romanticizing the state. And that's not the point. The point is actually to argue we often have weak states. In Italy, where I'm from, the state is not actually fulfilling its role. It's become a handout machine. It gives out guarantees, subsidies to different types of private actors without any real conditionality attached, for example. So the state funding becomes part of the problem, part of the inertia. And the state itself has not been investing, as NASA did, in its own brain. There's been an outsourcing of capacity to consulting companies. McKinsey, PwC, and Deloitte. They're actually running the Italian recovery program today. And so really, my point is to say, why are we failing so miserably today, for example, to deliver personal protection equipment to our frontline workers when we could get to the moon and back 51 years ago? And I think the answer is we are not putting urgency to social problems like we do to wartime scenarios. So if we treat seriously the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, turn them into moonshots and get state capacity, and it's not just one big state institution, but a decentralized network of different state institutions to work side by side with business around big problems, the next question is, what are the capabilities that we need within the public sector, within public administration? And why have we stopped investing within our public administration so that the mantra just looks at the deficit and the debt without asking what types of investments are required within our state institutions and what kind of relationships are needed between public and private in order to govern our economy so that it can be goal-oriented and produce growth that is more inclusive and sustainable. And the reason I set up a whole institution in London called the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose is I really believe we need new training within our civil service, not just thinking of the state as fixing market failures, which is how economists talk about the state, but the state as co-creating and co-shaping the markets of the future alongside business, but in order to really satisfy citizen needs. And the next question is, what is the training? What is the curriculum? Literally the textbooks that are required for such a proactive role of a state that can create creative bureaucracies and not inertial bureaucracies.
So can you tell us a little bit more about the training that actually goes on at the Institute in London?
So you might have heard sometimes this concept of neoliberal economics from the Chicago School, which basically set up this whole idea of the state as at best fixing market failures. Well, the training that then was delivered from that, the traditional training that continues to be delivered in global programs for civil servants, the masters in public administration, basically has been trickled down from that idea of the state, having to be careful not to become too big, otherwise it will be corrupted, it will get captured, and at best the state should be putting bandages here and there if you have problems around positive externalities, like basic research, the state has to come in and fund that. Negative externalities, a carbon tax, come in and do that. Asymmetric information, the state comes in and funds small companies. So the training that we provide says, okay, fine. If you're simply fixing different problems here and there, that's one curriculum. If you are going to be a proactive investor of first resort, not just a lender of last resort, we need a different curriculum, which is around shaping and creating markets. And we've created a curriculum around 4 pillars. The first one has to do with value. The second one has to do with purpose. I'll explain what I mean in a second. The third one has to do with creative bureaucracies. And the fourth one has to do with digital governance, or basically designed thinking around really key areas like our digital platforms. And so that first point about value, much of economic theory begins with the idea that value is created within business. And then what the state does is redistribute that value in the economy, or regulate the process, or fix problems, as I was talking about before. As soon as you reverse that and say, actually, the kind of state institutions we want are ones that themselves are part of the wealth creation process and the value creation process, then we need a different theory of value. It has to begin with a collective value creation theory, as opposed to the idea that value is just created in business and the state is a cheerleader on the side, or at worst, a problem on the side. So I won't go into more detail, but the first big pillar is rethinking the theory of value that we require in order to shape markets. The second is really about policy design. How can we, as I was saying before, put public purpose and public value at the center of the policy design process? This is where we teach what I've been advocating for some time in Europe, which is the mission-oriented approach, which means that instead of the state making random lists of sectors or technologies or firms to support or other categories, what does it mean to have all of policy, whether it's around education, health, energy, digital, to really focus on purpose, public purpose, and big problems, societal challenges? What does it mean for procurement policy? What does it mean for industrial strategy? What does it mean for outcomes-based budgeting? The third module is on the organizational dynamic. How can we get state organizations to welcome uncertainty, not to fear it, to be part of the risk-taking process, but to redefine the risk-reward relationship? If we are, from the first module, collectively creating value, what kind of culture do state organizations require in order to embrace the underlying risk, but also to learn along the way from the learning by doing, trial and error and error and error? What we have today are state organizations where the careers are just based on a very linear understanding of success. So civil servants are not allowed to experiment. And you know that if you weren't allowed to fall off your bicycle, you wouldn't learn how to ride a bicycle. So we don't really have learning and creative, dynamic organizations within the state. That's that module. And the last one is really about designed thinking. So there's a whole approach, mainly coming from the world of architecture and artists and urban planners that have tried to change the old way of thinking from top-down planning, think of Soviet planning, towards a much more horizontal process of planning. So long-run thinking, not short-run thinking, and the planning process, but at the center of it have this concept of designed thinking. Think of the European Bauhaus today. I don't know if your audience knows about it, but there's a very interesting initiative in the European Commission of rejuvenating the concept of the Bauhaus at the center of Europe. Well, what does that mean to really bring that design approach also to how we not only shape markets, but also govern them with the public good in mind, and reimagine what is possible? It's not just about building infrastructure. What does green infrastructure look like? What does digital infrastructure look like from a design thinking point of view? And how can we bring many different actors, stakeholders, to the table of that co-design, co-creation? So it's not, again, just a top-down, vertical, static process.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about your work with the European Commission? Because I think as early as 2017, you were called in as a special advisor to the European Commission to help them reshape their innovation policy. So today we have the EU Horizon Europe, which is the successor of Horizon 2020, and you were part in designing this policy. So can you let us know a little bit about this collaboration?
Sure. So at the time, Carlos Modas was the head of the Director General for Innovation and Science in the European Commission. He had read my work and asked me to come in to be an advisor. And I said, why don't we work together over the next year to turn what has until now been called a challenge-oriented approach in the European Commission, smart growth, inclusive growth, sustainable growth. Why don't we think of a way to get serious about that? Because it's not working. We've been talking about inclusive and sustainable growth in Europe now for many years, and yet we're not seeing real change. Are our economies more equal? Not really. Are we on a serious path towards sustainability? Not really. Have our policies like industrial strategy, innovation policy, and procurement policy been designed in order to really deliver on those goals? Not really. And so I worked with him to develop this idea that I was talking about before around the mission-oriented approach. And the idea was to begin with the challenges, which are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, but to interpret them at the level of the different member states, but also at the level of the European Commission with concrete missions like 100 carbon neutral cities across Europe, helping to get the plastic out of the ocean, confronting the problems that we have around an aging population, thinking about future of mobility, and using these challenges to really formulate, again, concrete targets that would involve many, many different sectors. Again, thinking back to the moon landing, it was not just aerospace. There was investment in nutrition, electronics, software, materials. Well, the same is true for climate change. It's not going to happen just by investing in renewable energy. We need to change how we construct homes, how we develop insurance programs, how we behave, how we regulate, and so on. And so the idea was to try to align different types of programs so that they were, again, outcomes focused, but really delivering in a targeted way. And what we meant by missions were societal, challenges that were societally relevant, coming from the SDG kind of, discourse, but that were much, much more targeted. So if you just stop at climate change, you almost don't know what to do. If you say we are going to develop in Europe 100 carbon neutral cities, it already starts to focus the mind. But it also requires, and this is, I think, where we are now, we need to really get our hands dirty in Europe with this. It really requires that redesign of the policy tools themselves. Missions are not just about talking about big goals. They are about redesigning our current levers, the tools that we have, that every government has, like public procurement. And the reason I always mention public procurement is that we sometimes get stuck thinking that there's no money. There's plenty of money being spent in ways that are not catalytic, that do not create additionality. In other words, stimulating investment in the business community that wouldn't have happened otherwise. So redesigning procurement or grants from a public bank or loans from a loan guarantee program, and literally focusing on the design of the partnerships themselves, as I talk about in my recent book, in order to be mission-oriented, that really requires what I have called a revolution inside government. It requires changes to occur within member states, within Europe, and how these policies are designed. And, Europe has now chosen 5 mission areas. This week, last Tuesday, it was decided that about 2 billion will be spent in the first, I think it's 3 years on these missions. But that's not going to be, enough just to put money in. We need to, again, go through that process of redesign so that those 2 billion can be creating a multiplier effect, because they will inspire other types of finance and budgets to come to the game. And if we don't do that, the money won't be enough. We should remember that, if you divide the whole Horizon budget, which is close to 100 billion, over European GDP, it's still much less than what the United States spend on innovation, what China spends on innovation. So we should both be thinking of increasing the quantity of innovation spend, redesigning it with a mission-oriented lens, but also making sure that how it's designed crowds in as much other types of pots of money as possible. And to do that, we need those capabilities that I was talking about before, because public money that simply increases profits is not going to work. It needs to increase investment. It needs to inspire. It needs to increase the expectations in the business community of where future opportunities lie. And if it doesn't do that, it fails.
Yeah. We're going to come back to the mission strategies before the end of our conversation. But I wanted to turn your attention to Cyprus. We're a small state, and we're certainly interested in building a sustainable innovation policy which will bear fruit and put Cyprus on the innovation map. What is your advice to small nations, we're not over 1 million, like Cyprus, which still have a very small startup community and limited access to international investor funding?
It's a very good question, and size does matter because it means that you need to focus much more than a larger country. However, what I have seen within size categories is that there's huge differences, sometimes even greater than the differences between, large and small countries. So if I look at Denmark, which is very small, it has become the #1 provider of high-tech green services to the Chinese economy. And China is spending over 2 trillion, 12 zeros, in the next 5 years on greening its entire economy. And the startup scene, basically in Copenhagen, which was, very dynamic, but didn't really have a direction, it very quickly, because Copenhagen wanted to be the greenest city in Europe, it started to have a buzz, again, a sense of purpose, linked with the procurement policies, both of the city and the nation around their own green strategy. And what was interesting was that that vision and the strategy from the top ended up allowing these small companies to scale up towards specific needs that were required at the local level in order to achieve that very ambitious goal of becoming the greenest city in Europe. So it's not my role to tell Cyprus what that innovation will be. What I can say is that if you can be, engaging with all your stakeholders in the citizen, type groups that you will have, different types of representatives from citizen organizations, the business community, public actors, and together formulate some safe spaces to really debate what you think your challenges are. And if you can, and then become, again, mission-oriented around those challenges, that will enable your startup to community to scale up with, ideally, aligned policies which help create new markets in Cyprus, which these companies can then service, right? So again, if you think of procurement as a demand side lever, not a supply side one, it can really help shape and create the markets that these companies provide to. Whereas if you just have a startup scene, because it looks good, everyone likes the word startup, it's not going to work because what it requires is a market. Otherwise, they don't scale up. You don't want startups to remain startups. You don't want small companies to remain small. They need to grow. But how they grow can be really helped by these kind of ambitious demand side policies as well. So I think there's 2 different issues. One is to really look carefully at your own organizations. Do you have patient finance? Patient long-term finance? If not, you will have a problem, because the private financial sector is often very impatient. Even venture capital, it wants to exit often in 3, 5, maximum 10 years. Whereas the kind of finance that many of these companies need is often over a 10-year cycle because of that kind of Death Valley phase and that, need to, that time lag between invention, commercialization, and so on. So you should look at what kind of patient finance you have. You should look at linkages between science and industry. Cyprus has very good science, but if you don't have a dynamic linkage between your academy of sciences and your industry, that's also a problem. So think of what are the kinds of institutions that can create a more dynamic flow of knowledge, information, dissemination of knowledge between science and industry. but also, what are the demand side tools? For example, I always go back to procurement, as you can see, like procurement, but not only, it could also be demand side tools around, like in Norway, they've had really interesting policies in order to get people to change their behavior. You can, if you look at how electric cars have been stimulated there. So Tesla sells 30% of its cars in Norway because you can park in the city without paying. If you have an electric car, you can drive on the taxi lane to get to the airport. And of course, the tax is lower too. Behaviors can shift if you make it easier for consumers to move, to shift their behavior in a particular direction. But that itself is not enough. What becomes interesting is how you can create a dynamic hub of different types of activities around a green strategy, like Denmark did with these new types of services that service a green transition. So I think it's really up to your local stakeholders in Cyprus to be ambitious on what goals you think you should be setting, and then to align all these different types of government policies around that goal so that the sum is greater than the parts.
Yeah. Well, Cyprus, it's a southern Mediterranean state and has the culture of a southern Mediterranean state and the mindset. Agility is not in our DNA, and changes occur slowly over time with lack of urgency. We undertake projects that should be finished in 6 months, but they are finished in 2 to 5 years. Maybe some people here will tell me they finish in 10 years. So we're not Israel, we're not the United Arab Emirates, we're not the Baltic states, we're certainly not Silicon Valley. But I don't say that there are people here who believe in innovation, who believe this is the future. And I guess a lot of key policymakers believe that. But we get lost in translation. So I was looking for this how of innovation, given this mindset, because I'm sure you met this mindset before in many different parts of the world that you are dealing with.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And again, coming from Italy, we have many of the same issues that you've talked about, but we need to be careful. There's no reason it has to be that way. It's not because we are from Southern Europe. Goldman Sachs had a terrible expression. They called Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain the pigs. Terrible expression. And it was during the period where we had completely the wrong idea of why in Europe some countries were competing, were growing, were innovating, and some were not. And the mantra, the ideology was that the southern countries like Cyprus, Greece, Spain, Italy were simply having, very big states, spending too much money, high public deficit. So all the focus became to cut state expenditure, as opposed to rethink the state organizations and make the investment and the expenditure more strategic, catalytical, and have a higher multiplier effect. To do that, we need to do everything we just talked about. But what really matters, I think, is to unpick the problems. So in Italy, for example, we had a very large state-owned enterprise called IRI, la Istituzione della Ricostruzione Italiana, which was set up in the 1930s by Mussolini, so not a great beginning, but it had 3 different phases. The first phase was public, but not politicized. The second phase was public, super politicized. All the parties got their hands in the middle. They even chopped up Rai or broadcaster, Alitalia, telecoms, and so on into different pieces for each party. And the third phase was privatized. What's interesting is the second phase and the third phase were equally terrible. So it's not about public or private. It's how do you govern a public institution to be purpose-oriented but not politicized. In the first phase, they attracted the top managers in Italy. It was an honor to work for this state institution. And they were able to construct the motorway from north to south, called the Autostrada del Sole, in just 4 years. Whereas recently, it's taken us 20 years, I'm thinking of the numbers you said for Cyprus, just to construct the motorway from Torino to Milano, which is like, a small chunk of the top of Italy. And so that capacity to deliver, to implement policy, even on a motorway, which is much easier than solving, climate change or approaching our big challenges around inequality. It depends on the implementation capacity on the ground. And in Italy, it was very interesting. At the beginning of COVID, in the first lockdown, we were 100% dependent on Chinese personal protection equipment. And of course, as you know, everyone was very dependent on Chinese personal protection equipment, so we didn't have enough of it. In 3 months, between March and June or whatever, those first 3 months in the spring, Italy became 100% independent, producing all of its personal protection equipment because it quickly, because of the urgency, it felt like wartime, changed its procurement methods in order to build capacity within Italian industry between 137 small medium enterprises that were then able to deliver for the state the material that was required for frontline workers. So why don't we do that in normal times? Why do we have to wait either for war or an emergency like a health pandemic where hundreds of thousands of people are dying in order to get our acts together and transform a state institution into dynamic, agile, outcomes-oriented? So I think this also happened globally. I just wrote a report with UNDP about the capabilities that we saw as central to places like Kerala in India, Vietnam. Both of these places did much, much better than some other countries on the back of having, over the last 15 years, made those kinds of investments, turning their states into much more agile, flexible, creative, and dynamic institutions. And it's not because they are on a specific size, coming back to your earlier question, or specific phase of development. It's on the back of specific decisions they have made to increase the strength of their state institutions, public-private partnerships, but also to build trust with citizens. And so I think this is very important for a country like, Cyprus, which again has good raw material in terms of, again, science, capacity, skills, a very educated population. But then you need to, have that kind of dynamism within the state institutions for what can be a potential good resource, both in human capital and physical capital and tangible capital, to actually deliver on the outcome you want. And we shouldn't get stuck in thinking that it's because we're in Southern Europe or culture or something is going to make us slower. If you look at whether it's Cyprus, Greece, Italy, Spain, you can look at specific phases of our history where things worked better than in other phases. And we need to better understand how the future, if we care about a green transition, a healthy economy, lower inequality, it's going to require real revolution in how we are currently working. And it's not about, north versus south. It's about really transforming the current levers from being static, inertial, one-way kind of handout machines towards really turning them into, these catalytic levers. And we need to understand kind of what works, what doesn't. Israel, which you mentioned, is often called startup nation. It would never have been startup nation if they didn't have Yozma. Yozma is a public venture capital fund in Israel, which was central to providing that ambitious, strategic, patient finance for Israeli startups. They also had a huge inflow of talent when the Berlin Wall fell, with many Eastern European Jewish people moving to Israel. They also have had a huge amount of public money coming from the US Department of Defense. So it's actually quite hard to replicate. But if you also look at the science industry linkages that they have that I mentioned before, if you look at the finance they have and the outcomes orientation, which in their case has often been due to the geographic, geopolitical issues they have, the question is, what is the equivalent of that for a country like Cyprus to be goal-oriented, science industry linkages, patient finance, getting the scientific community to work, alongside business on, important goals, always starting with the SDGs, and to allow the technology and the increases in productivity to flow from that kind of common purpose, common agenda, and national innovation system.
Okay, we have about 4 minutes, Mariana, and suppose our Minister of Innovation or our Chief Scientist are listening to you right now. What is the best advice you can give them?
to set themselves some metrics over the next year. You know, how can you judge whether you're serious or not? How can we stop just talking? How can we walk the talk? So, you know, and I always go back to the Green Deal, because I think, you know, if you read the IPCC report from this summer, from August, it says we have 8 years left until climate change, global warming, is completely irreversible. So the first question would be, what does that mean for Cyprus? How can you think about your mobility systems, your social housing, but even your public education with a green lens, right? So what does green and the Green Deal and the IPCC urgency around that, how can it be interpreted in Cyprus? How can it help set an investment and an innovation trajectory that changes how you're currently doing things? What are the types of metrics that you will judge yourself along in 6 months and 12 months? And the second thing is, begin with the local, begin with really practical changes. I've been very inspired by Sweden, because they began with very specific things like school meals, the meals that students eat inside their schools. You know, they set an agenda that they had to be healthy, tasty, and sustainable. And if you have a sustainable production of school meals in schools, that means that, you know, the production, distribution, the consumption, all of a sudden has a target, which requires investment in innovation in a new direction, in a sustainable way. And that itself requires, again, you know, businesses to think differently, which will stimulate investment in new skills, new types of jobs, new thinking, new technology, new services, which then, you know, the growth and the productivity flows from that. But the irony is, if you obsess about productivity, if you obsess about jobs, it actually doesn't happen, because it's not moving in any direction. So we don't create those dynamic interlinkages between sectors, as, again, the moon landing had. So I think those are the two things I would start with. What does the green urgency mean in Cyprus? Bring together different stakeholders to set goals on that. And second, get very serious about using that to transform your existing ways of doing things, like with procurement. And third, make it inspirational. Get people involved. You know, with the school meals, get children involved. Help them learn about it through the curriculum. Help them become part of that co-design of school meals, so it's fun, right? Make it not top down, but as horizontal as possible. And, you know, I think the history books will tell the story of those countries which got their acts together, and those which just sat on their asses during this period, forgive the language, which, you know, definitely requires what Greta Thunberg, who's now 18 years old, she says, when your house is on fire, what do? Do you sit there and debate? Should I go? Should I not? What should I bring? You get out, and you get out quickly. And we're not moving at that speed right now with the biggest global crisis we have. But instead of seeing it with fear, instead of seeing it as a negative, what not to do, let's see it as an opportunity. You know, decarbonization as development, decarbonization as innovation, as also a way for new actors to come together to have debates, discussions, bringing citizen assemblies together, even in our, you know, housing estates, if we want to have green housing and so on. So it's an opportunity for a revival of democracy and for faith that policy actually matters to people's lives.
Mariana Mazzucato, thank you so much for being with us today. It was an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.